in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at All Voices. Today, I am very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Mika J. She is the Federal Workplace Expert and Workplace Transformation Strategic Advisor. Mika, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be a part of today's conversation. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm Mika, as you mentioned. I'm originally from rural Maine, a very small lake town outside of the only second city really that anyone knows in the state of Maine, which is Bangor. So if you're a Stephen King fan, Stephen King hails from Bangor. I'm about 15 minutes away. I'm one of those people that can say that I grew up on a dirt road and walked a mile uphill in sub-zero weather in both directions. And that was actually true. So really excited to be a part of today's conversation because I really wouldn't have been where I'm at today if it weren't for a career in public service and for my advocacy in flexible, remote, and transformational workplace practices. So if you were to ask me when I was that little girl in that little tiny lake town in Maine, what I wanted to be when I grew up, seriously, no joke, I would have told you I wanted to be a ballerina, a witch, and a gorilla. Because, I could think that I would be just anything. But as I grew older out of, elementary school age and into my college years, and also I served with the United States Army, by the way, so I am an Army veteran too. I started really loving the connections between strategy and people and culture and the mission. And so I realized the power of strategic communications and organizational change and that synergy with human capital and HR, traditional operations roles. So I very quickly kind of transformed my own thought of what I could be when I grew up into someone that just made the world of work better.
I love that. I have so many questions around how you're making the world of work better for so many kind of organizations and how you kind of consult and help folks really think about how they can make their workplace an employer of choice. Mika, what would you say defines you as a person? I always like to ask before getting into all of my kind of specific questions about the work you do.
Yeah, I think the number one word that comes to mind is authenticity. I really pride myself on being an authentic leader. I enjoy being relatable. I love bringing in real world stories, both from my own background, but from those successes that I've helped shape and create with other people to give a credit to how impactful different ways of doing business can be. So yeah, I think authenticity would be how I first and foremost kind of describe me and my business approach too.
I love the word authenticity. I think it's so important and kind of related to how everybody is trying to show up at work nowadays, and also what organizations are trying to lean into and creating that really authentic company culture as well. I'm sure you're working on a lot of different projects. What are some of the current problems you're trying to solve in your kind of day-to-day work?
It's funny because I've actually been working in the field of transformational, work flexibility for a long, long time. I know I'm only looking 21 to you on this recording today, but I've actually been around a long time. And what's interesting is that many of the same problems and challenges that we were experiencing, when telework or telecommuting or work from home was just being rolled out in tandem with other suites of flexible ways of working, even part-time or job sharing or alternate work schedules. The bottom line is that we were up against culture and what people who are in those traditional roles of leadership considered important for growing the next generation of leaders. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that centers around physical presence. I think a lot of the challenges we're experiencing today are around personal hidden biases. Yeah. And I don't just mean that in the equity space. I really mean that also in the way that people consider the world of work. Many of the more seasoned leaders in our organizations of today grew up watching their parents get up, get dressed, and go to work. That was the model of which they formulated their thoughts and ideals around what work looked like. And so fast forward to now, many people were, pushed into this accelerated rate of remote and hybrid working. Not everyone was, but what it also did is it took away choice. And so what's fascinating is that the one tried and true thing around work flexibility, including remote work and hybrid work and flexible kind of scheduling, is that it cannot be a one size fits approach. It cannot be a one size fits all, because we are clearly a workforce that's comprised of more than 5 generations of workers. The silent generation is now coming to work, and they are the most resilient group of candidates that we know. And then fast forward up to, people are still working sometimes up to upwards of a 60-year career into their mid and late 70s, and they're continuing to be in the workplace. So again, like having a choice around how, when, and where you bring your best to work is really, really important. And during pandemic, those who maybe typically were not well suited for remote or working from home arrangements sort of had to be. So the paradigm shifted, right? Because we really had to focus on a business case or a business need for why people had to be physically present if they in fact could be working from home, versus the alternate, which was back in the day where everybody had to, create a business case for why they should be able to work flexibly or from a different location, and how they were going to accomplish all of these duties, even though we knew they were portable and suitable for different locations. You sort of had to justify it. So I think if you're asking me around what are the biggest challenges, it's still that, right? It's the culture piece. I think Peter Drucker said it best, right? Like culture eats strategy for breakfast. So here we are.
So here we are. You're right. There's no one size fits all approach. There's no blueprint out here, even though a lot of us wish that there was this magical playbook in creating a wonderful company culture. There are some through lines, as you were talking about, a lot of organizations who were maybe opposed to or just didn't have it in place at the time are leaning into remote work. Do you think that every organization, whether we're talking about federal, private, or public, should implement some form of customization in terms of remote work or hybrid, and why or why not?
I wish I could say yes, but the reality is still that many of our occupations industry wide, whether or not they're private, public sector, academia, nonprofit, you name it, much of our workforce still has to be done from a physical location or on premise. And so not every job is suitable for a alternate work location, but many are. I would say for sure, those organizations who are forced into this way of working during the pandemic should take a really close, hard look at what those policies are as they look to their back to office strategies. And I hate that word back, because to me, it really infers going backwards. But I think there are some opportunities for us to really stay in this posture, knowing that not everyone's going to choose to continue to do that. I think a lot of times organizations are just so worried and nervous about, oh my goodness, if I allow this remote work policy, is everybody going to choose to be offsite, and nobody will ever want to be back in the office together or want to work in a co-located space together. And that's just simply not the case. Again, back to that adage that we were talking about, which is there's really not a one size fits all approach, but there could be a really wise strategy that incorporates those kinds of choices for different ways that people are working.
Mm-hmm. I think when we're talking about personalization at scale, every employee and person is different at different points of their career, as you were talking about too. Some people have 50, 60 years of experience. People are entering their first jobs. So really taking that into account and giving people kind of a menu of those options and having those conversations. I would love to ask too, with the clients you work with and the people that you are talking to at a day-to-day at a really high level, where is the future of federal work going? Is it kind of more remote, or what are the trends that you're seeing?
Well, I'm really excited to report that, the rates of those who are working from home on a daily, everyday basis rose from about 20% pre-pandemic to over 60% government-wide for the nation's largest employer, which is the federal government, right? So that's across the entire work span of public sector federal employees. And the good news is that, the Office of Personnel Management, the Office of Management and Budget, the Secure, Safer Federal Workforce Task Force, and this current administration is really focused on trying to position the federal government as a best-in-class employer. Again, it is the nation's largest employer. It's comprised of more than 2 million federal workers globally. But 80% of them already reside outside of the national capital region in Washington, D.C. So it really makes sense to serve the American people the way that we need to increase and enhance diversity and inclusion and customer satisfaction and customer experience, to be able to have those kinds of options, because we've got to bring in new talent and we've got to be able to retain the great talent that we have and still deliver on the promise to America of why the government exists overall. So I'm happy to report that there is a large emphasis on doing that. The challenge is that, often the government will allow individuality from organization to organization to sort of determine and decide what that policy is going to look like in action for their workforce. And that's a challenge if there's not some structure and rigor around at least some form of expectations and standards. For instance, if said position was working this way during pandemic, we're going to automatically code that position as at least eligible. It doesn't mean that their suitability will be determined based on during the pandemic kind of working, but if in fact they were working successfully and did so from an alternate location during pandemic, it makes sense to continue to at least allow the choice for someone to decide, yeah, I want to continue working this way, or at least enhanced working from home options like 2 or 3 days a week. And do I get the option? Yay or nay? And so I'm really excited to see where the federal government goes. In fact, I've already seen some very senior level executive leadership positions being coded as fully remote or geographically independent in terms of location. And just think of what that does to open the aperture for, talent acquisition and bringing the next wave of public servants into the federal government.
Right. It definitely opens up the opportunity for more accessibility, more opportunity for equity and flexibility, and really opening up opportunities for folks as well to really help build the federal government as an employer of choice too.
Yeah.
Are there any other patterns that you wanted to highlight and how kind of the federal government clients have been working with you especially over the past three years?
Yeah, I really like the fact that many organizations are really taking a very high touch approach to employee well-being and the employee experience. And they're doing it in a different way, whether that be facilitated dialogues around critical and crucial conversations, or teaching new skills and competencies and empathy, or listening, or really focusing on those culture and values pieces that I think traditionally in a bureaucracy as large as the federal government, and often in a military sort of command and control function that is as structured and old as the federal government, sometimes that gets pushed to the side in traditional times. You don't want to show your colors. A leader always leads and doesn't really show that kind of more personal, humanized approach. And over the past 3 years, organizations across the board, but really the federal government, have been digging in deep too to how can leadership and management skills and competencies be developed and grown to serve as sort of a coach instead of just a manager of things or people, and to be able to inspire and listen and look for indicators that maybe your folks might not be doing as well as they say they are or appear to be. And then also changing the culture to be able to be vulnerable and authentic and have really important kinds of conversations that are human-based around comfort and care and support. Because at the end of the day, people spend the majority of their lives at work. And so if we can teach leaders how to connect with people on a different level, maybe a more human level, I think we'll all benefit.
Yeah, connecting with people on a more human level, definitely having that expectation around managers to be coaches and leaders who are leading with empathy and vulnerability and modeling that behavior, having those conversations proactively is definitely something that we we have seen as well. And when we're talking about these leadership changes, these opening up of opportunities for folks to join different organizations, and of course, remote work and transformational change, it all filters up into that what's in the title of our interview series for company culture. And I want to ask your opinion on what are qualitative and quantitative ways you can really continue to measure company or organizational culture.
Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you now. There was a slight pause, so I didn't hear the beginning of your answer. So if you could start from the beginning. Great.
Sorry about that.
No, you're good.
Okay, where was I going with that? Let me just think. To some degree, this answer may be dependent on the kind of industry or occupation composition of your workforce, but primarily this is tried and true for really any organization. And I think the combination of things like survey data, of course, pulse checks, maybe taking a peek at some of the analytics, not to be intrusive around how many hours people are logged on and how many minutes of a hour are they actually logged onto their computer and keystroking. That's not what I'm insinuating, but there are some really great tools and analytics tools from the tech side that can help be indicators to whether or not your workforce might be not overperforming, but maybe like on the brink of burnout and how productive they're being. The other, qualitative ways are to sort of open the aperture to these kinds of conversations. And really, I'm such a huge fan of an integrated approach because of how diverse our workforces are. And so if you really want to focus on inclusivity and belonging, then you need to allow people to be able to feel comfortable to speak their truth. And your truth might not be my truth, but teaching people on the left and right flanks at the peer-to-peer level to listen and support one another as well will continue to benefit the organization and help leadership understand the health of their organization as well overall, especially as it relates to culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking your truth and having the kind of environment where it's open for feedback, whether it's positive, negative, constructive, anything in between, you need to have that layer or foundation of intention and that level of trust too. We know that for transformational change, things don't happen overnight if it's sustainable, but there are ways that we can make changes tomorrow that impact long term. For organizations, for example, who are trying to be less hierarchical and more quote unquote trusting as an organization, how can we really measure that? Are there any like KPIs that you look to within an organization?
Yeah, for sure. A lot of them are around like internal communications too. It's like how many people are showing up to a specific event, how many people are interacting in the conversation and dialogue, whatever that might be. Maybe you have an anonymous feedback mechanism. Well, to me, an indicator would be if most people are asking their questions in an anonymous way and not feeling comfortable doing it on the live event or in front of their peers. That is a glaring indicator that people do not feel comfortable showing their true colors in front of others. And so, as a leader, I would be looking at ways to kind of enhance that and maybe change it. Some as well. And then the other thing is like really, again, looking for any and all opportunities to collect feedback, input, insights, and close the feedback loop. So when you do invite people to give thought, of course, you can't act on every single idea, suggestion, or complaint that comes through, but you certainly can reassure the workforce that you heard them and that you listen to them. And that can be done through regular, email communication or town hall events or one-on-ones or informal coffee and teas, or even in the feedback channel itself, if you have one that's more automated.
Yeah, absolutely. Creating those avenues, understanding that everybody is different in how they want to communicate, especially someone who's worked at an organization for 20 days as opposed to 20 years. In terms of that active listening piece, even if you can't action on something tomorrow, we see that listening is really key to really thriving company cultures that have retained a lot of talent. How do you see employee feedback management as an important tool to proactively build that culture of listening? And how does that manifest at really successful organizations across the board?
Yeah, I'm seeing a huge trend in the federal government of trying to figure that out because traditionally, Uncle Sam would rely on its annual federal employee viewpoint survey data, which is great. It's a great benchmark, but it's also perception based and it's as an assessment on that one day in time. So, maybe if you were having a particularly hard week, you might have different rankings. I'm really liking the fact that organizations are just thinking more dynamically about how to capture this information and how to teach leadership, again, the ability to connect and invite feedback on an ongoing basis. That can be in your one-on-one discussions, your check-ins, and more informal events, and also through those survey and pulse survey mechanisms as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like opening up the opportunity and doing this on an ongoing basis, making sure it's not a kind of a closed door conversation or like instead of a period at the end of a sentence, like an ellipses or something like that, to make sure that you are responding to the feedback that's given too, whether that's in one-on-ones or you're asked and in all hands as well. You mentioned kind of anonymous feedback. Why is it important to offer kind of these avenues as well to get all of the feedback?
Yeah, because, again, different people have different comfort levels of how they might ask or feel comfortable in specific topics. That really, I'd say, pay very close attention to those anonymous feedback channels because the kinds of content that come in there can be really great indicators in terms of what action areas you might want to, um, you know, co-create. I want to say co-create because it's not always the leader's problem to solve. Culture is everyone. It's the collective regard. So yes, you're in a leadership position to effectuate change, but I am such a fan of inviting the workforce to be a part of that. So I'm also seeing this trend in like further expanding employee resource groups, whether it be, remote employee resource groups, whether it be like a culture council, and sort of at a grassroots level to invite the workforce to be a part of shaping what that looks like and how to focus on different areas. It gives them opportunities for leadership. It gives them opportunities for communication. It allows them to sort of drive the different initiatives that they think are most important. And then you have like executive sponsors that can be there if they get stuck and can't get to a solution quickly or fast enough. So I think that it's incredibly important to have that multi-pronged, multi-dimensional approach to allowing people to engage how they feel most comfortable. And ultimately, as you enhance the health of your culture, more people are going to be able to talk to one another, voice concerns. I mean, think about psychological safety aspects and what that can mean to the quality and quality control and risk of the work that you do on a daily basis. I mean, we need to have psychological safety in our workplaces, or else people will not feel comfortable flagging mistakes and really there could be dangerous things that occur if people don't feel comfortable waving a red flag and saying, wait, something doesn't look right. Or I'm concerned about that. Can you tell me more about it? If they're not allowed and encouraged to ask questions and take risks and poke holes and question things, I feel like, good luck.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that psychological safety is absolutely critical. It's really built into the company culture. And you're right, everybody is kind of a culture champion at the organization. All of these actions, no matter what department you're in, the modeling behind leaders, managers, and executives is also super important as well. And it all comes together to create the environment that people are working in on a day-to-day basis. I agree with you. We spend lots of time at work, so we really should be intentional about kind of the environment we're creating there.
Yeah.
In terms of psychological safety and creating that employer of choice. For March 2022, it's Women's History Month and also International Women's Day. And the theme this year is Break the Bias. And I would love to ask how we can break the bias for women in the federal government and what advice you have for folks, specifically women and other folks, to get involved for opportunities within the federal government.
Yeah, well, I love the theme for this year's Women's History Month. It's so great. I mean, now's our time, especially if you're considering a career change or career move or looking to come back to work and you've taken some time off. The federal government is a great place to look for a long-term career with a lot of different opportunities and upward mobility. And now more than ever, because of remote and flexible work, there'll be even more opportunities, especially for those women who might be in active parenting roles or caregiving roles, or maybe in the sandwich generation doing both, or even if you're an early careerist thinking about what the possibilities could be. So first and foremost, there's a couple different routes that can give leverage to individuals, not just women, but let's talk about different categories of workers who have what's called sort of non-competitive hiring preference. And the first one I want to highlight are military spouses. Typically, military spouses comprise about 90% female. They skew female. Not all of them are female, but the U.S. government is committed to hiring, recruiting, and attracting and retaining military spouses. And there are non-competitive hiring career paths for spouses specifically. And so consider if you're able to find a position that offers remote and flexible work and is looking to hire spouses. That's a great way for women who might serve in that capacity to find an entry pathway to the U.S. government. The other way is through a non-competitive hiring pathway for people with disabilities. And often that may be a stigma that we would consider not wanting to disclose, but even a hidden disability could qualify you under that hiring pathway. So for instance, certain emotional or mental kind of challenges, and again, I'm looking for us to be strong and break the stigma around that. So whether that be, potentially a neurological issue like being on the spectrum or ADHD or bipolar, depression, anxiety, those kinds of diagnoses can actually qualify you for a different pathway into a career with the federal government. There are many, many others. There's about 92 special hiring authorities, but those are the primary ones that I would suggest women take a look at. And don't be afraid to, self-identify in that capacity. A third way is, especially for those technologists and entrepreneurs, the government is always looking to bring in innovators from public sector. And so there are a number of really great programs like the Presidential Innovation Fellowship Program, the Presidential Management Fellowship Program. That would be for recent graduates, both from if you finished your PhD, your master's degree, or your bachelor's degree. They're very highly competitive, but very selective and a great way to get your foot in the door. And there's some other CX fellows. So if you're in customer experience, data science programs, now the government's looking to bring in non-competitively. And then last but not least, student pathways programs. So that's really designed for anyone that's over age 16. It could be for high school students, could be for college students. You don't have to have been a graduate, but even if you graduated within the last 2 years, you can qualify under that special hiring authority too. So I wanted to highlight just those kinds of, not all of them, of course, but ways that you can entry. And the best way to take a look for those federal opportunities are on usajobs.gov. But here's a little trick. If you're looking for the government jobs that have flexibilities, remote and hybrid offerings, you might want to take a look at flex jobs too, because flex jobs can bring in government roles that they've already hand screened and verified, offer those kinds of flexibilities that you might be looking for.
I love that. That's a great tip for our kind of audience listening as well. And I appreciate you sharing some examples of the many different pathways that people can take into federal government roles and just the translatable experience that you can also kind of contribute in these roles too. Mika, we've talked about kind of that organizational change, transformations happening, remote work, and really company culture. Is there anything that I didn't ask you want to share with folks who are listening, or maybe underscoring 1 to 2 key takeaways you hope people bring with them?
Okay, so I'll just make mention, and this, I'm going to speak to the employers here now. We had close to 3 million women drop out of the civilian labor market during the pandemic by virtue of their parental duties and caregiving duties. and a little bit around the kinds of jobs that they were holding pre-pandemic, right? It is our duty to bring them back to work. It makes dollars and cents to invest in women and bringing them back to work. I can go on and on about the statistics and the benefits of having a highly gender diverse workforce as well. But I would say look for opportunities. Returnships are great. They're like the opposite of internships. They're actually bringing people back into the workforce, maybe even at the senior levels, because maybe they left and now are willing to come back. Consider offering those flexible choices. It doesn't all have to be fully remote. It could be, some on-site, some off-site. It could be flexible schedules, compressed work schedules and different shifts, part-time, seasonal, job sharing. You have these at your disposal. And if you need consultants and experts to help look through what that workforce strategy is, there are so many. I have so many friends and colleagues. In fact, you've talked to many of them on your podcast previously. And just tools that are out there, but it really benefits the workforce. And if you're thinking about the future of work, it really starts today and now.
I love it. Those are some great calls to action for our employers who are listening too. And I definitely agree with you around kind of that diversity of gender, diversity of thought, and background for an organization is not only a nice to have, but a need to have, a business imperative. So we need to be thinking about these on a continuous basis. Mika, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening and all voices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the organization to succeed overall. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon, everyone.